But even if we disregard the whole debate about the authorship of Deuteronomy 34, Jews and Christians should at least believe that God is giving the author a unique futuristic view, a prophecy viewed from the future perspective, looking back through human history to the time of Moses. In other words, the text is not viewing the past from the present, but viewing the past from the future. A future prophecy which stretches from the time of Moses, or the author of Deuteronomy 34, until the end of the line of Israelite prophets and the advent of Muhammad. Despite the evidence I am presenting, there are also many people who claim that the prophet, like Moses, mentioned in Deuteronomy 18, is not Muhammad, but Jesus, as I mentioned earlier. Let's examine this further and see if it could in fact be Jesus. The Jews at Jesus' time were waiting for God to send three individual men. According to John chapter 1, verse 25, they are, as you see in the next slide. Number 1, the return of Elijah. Number 2, the promised awaited Messiah. And number 3, the prophet like Moses. Now we must first find out who these three men are. According to Matthew chapter 11, verse 14, and chapter 17, verses 12 to 13, John the Baptist is the return of Elijah. As for the second individual, the awaited Messiah, it is Jesus, according to John chapter 4, verses 25 to 26. As for the third individual, the prophet like Moses, this has to be Muhammad for the following reasons. Number 1, we have already seen the great similarities between Moses and Muhammad. Number 2, Muhammad was an Ishmaelite Arab from the brethren of the Israelites. Number 3, the prophet will speak in God's name, which is what Muhammad did, according to Quran chapter 53, verse 3 to 4, as we already saw. Number 4, Deuteronomy 18, verses 21 to 22 say that what the prophet prophesies must come true if he is a true prophet. And Muhammad's prophecies did come true. Just to give you one example, he prophesied that the Muslims would defeat the two superpowers at his time, the Byzantine and Persian empires. This was fulfilled just after his death. Can you imagine the 7th century Arab desert Arabs who were still too few and too weak would go on to defeat not just one superpower but two superpowers? To prophesy their mere survival would have been fantastic. Well, it did happen, and these are historical facts. Number 5, we saw in Deuteronomy 34:10 that the prophet could not come from Israel or the Israelite nation, but he must come from outside it. Muhammad came from the Ishmaelites, from Arabia, which is outside Israel. Number 6, we saw that the prophet like Moses could not be Jesus or John the Baptist. John the Baptist was the return of Elijah. Jesus was the awaited Messiah. This leaves us only with Muhammad as the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 18:18. And number 7, Jesus prophesied the coming of Prophet Muhammad, as we will see later when I give evidence from the New Testament. So I conclude this point by reminding myself and you all that God tells us that we must accept and follow that prophet like Moses. In fact, in the Bible, God gives us an order and a warning, a stern warning, not to reject him. That's how important this prophecy is. Continuing on with Deuteronomy 18, it says in the very next verse, as you see on the slide, "If any man will not listen to my words, which he," meaning that prophet, "he speaks in my name, I myself will make him answer for it." Deuteronomy 18:19. Notice the words, "speaks in my name." This description again matches exactly with the revelation given to Prophet Muhammad, because out of the 114 chapters of the Quran, 113 of them begin with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, which means in the name of God, the most merciful, the most gracious. Moving on now to my next point from the Torah. We will look at Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2. As you see on the slide, it says, quote, "And he said, the Lord came from Sinai, and dawned on them from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran, and he came with 10,000s of saints. From his right hand came a fiery law for them." At first glance, this verse appears to be in the past tense. not a future prophecy. However, when we understand the philosophical concept that God is outside of time, then we understand that, and God is, of course, and time, of course, is created. It's a created concept by God, and God himself is outside his creation. We then understand that God is not constrained by the laws of this world, and from his perspective, everything can be considered in the past tense. Also, this verse mentions the word Lord. In the Hebrew text, it's written with 4 letters without vowels, transliterated into English as YHWH. The proper pronunciation for this tetragrammaton is Yahuwah, which means, "Oh he," or "Oh he is." The implied meaning is, "Oh, he is God." And as I said before, God is not bound by time. So, even though this verse appears to be referring to something in the past, it actually is a future prophecy. In any case, this verse would have been understood by the Israelites to be a future prophecy, as will be made clear to you when I refer to Deuteronomy 33:2, which speaks of future prophets to come. So let's dissect this verse and make it easier to understand. Firstly, when this verse says the Lord came from Sinai, what do you think, or who do you think this is referring to? What great prophet of God is most famous for coming from Mount Sinai, or Sinai Desert? I think we can all answer this question pretty easily. It is obviously a reference to Moses, because he received his revelation on Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 19, verse 20. In other words, God came to us through the inspired teachings of prophet Moses, and it was God who led the believers through Moses in the Sinai. So this part of the verse is an explicit reference to prophet Moses and how God came or guided people through him. Secondly, the verse says, "and dawned on them from Seir." Where is Seir, and what prophet of God is this alluding to? Seir is usually associated with the chain of mountains west and south of the Dead Sea, extending through Jerusalem and Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus. It was later extended to include the mountains on the east side as well, according to the Dictionary of the Bible by John L. Mackenzie, page 783. This could not be a reference to Moses because he never entered Palestine. So we should conclude that Seir refers to Jesus. Now to the rest of the verse, which says, quote, "He shone forth from Mount Paran, and he came with 10,000s of saints. From his right hand came a fiery law for them." What prophet was passionate about using his right hand, who was also given a law from God, and who shone forth from Paran, or Mount Paran? First, we need to find out where Mount Paran is. According to Genesis 21:21, Paran is a desert wilderness, the place where Abraham's wife Hagar and their son Ishmael settled. Ishmael, of course, being the father of the Arabs. It is common knowledge that Ishmael is the father of the Arabs, like Isaac and Jacob are the fathers of the Jews. These facts are generally not disputed by anyone, so I don't need to prove those points. But where is Paran, the place where Ishmael, the father of the Arabs, settled? The answer is Arabia, the land of the Arabs. History tells us that Abraham took Hagar and Ishmael to Arabia, in particular to a mountainous region known as Becca. It's called in Psalms 84:7, and in the Quran, chapter 3, verse 96. Today we call it Mecca. So Paran must be in Arabia, and in particular Mount Paran is the chain of mountains in that same region which the Arabs now call Sarawat Mountains. It is interesting to note that Prophet Muhammad received the first revelation in the cave of Hira, located in these mountains. Is there any other biblical evidence which will help us to locate Paran? Yes, if we turn to Habakkuk, one of the last books of the Old Testament, we read in chapter 3, verse 3, as you see in the next slide, "God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise." So again we find Mount Paran, which is where Hagar and Ishmael settled. Genesis 21:21. That is Arabia.